Hi, I'm Kyle with Fielding Tree Care. Today we're here to talk about the Quaking Aspen, Populus tremuloides. A few distinguishing characteristics of the aspen is its white bark, and if you can hear it in the breeze, that kind of shaking sound that it makes, which is why it's called a quaking aspen. They have a flattened leaf petiole, so it might be hard to see, but it's very flattened this way, which actually leads to that shaking nature and leads to that sound that they make. They also have a very distinct leaf shape, kind of this rounded spade shape, not very deep set, with a little bit of serration on those lobes. The white bark is often fissured, but it'll have these kind of horizontal fissures and these really dark branch spots. You can kind of see them in here. Other trees that have kind of this white bark sometimes have this horizontal fissuring, but won't have as much of this distinct white blotting. When they're young, they tend to be a bit more green. So here we have a younger aspen, and you can see a lot more of that green gray tint versus that whiter tint. Another distinguishing characteristic of the aspen is that their bark sheds in individual cell layers. So if you come up to generally the sunny side of the tree and you give it a good wipe, you'll get this white, well, I'm too pale, but you'll get this white kind of cell layer instead of the bark sloughing off in like peels like some other trees do. Another characteristic that's kind of cool is that little bit of green to the trunk is actually chlorophyll. Unlike many trees, aspens have chlorophyll in their bark, so even when they drop their leaves in winter, they still have some photosynthesis happening throughout winter that really makes them pretty hardy for this environment. Let's talk growing conditions. Aspens typically grow in zones 2 through 6. They also like kind of those higher elevations. They say 5,000 to 12,000 feet, but really they like the higher end of that. They also like more rocky, well-drained, kind of hilly soils versus being down in like really wet, irrigated areas. So aspens in the wild, in nature, can live hundreds of years because they send out clones from their roots, and individual trees will actually have a pretty short life expectancy, but the whole plant organism can live, I think, upwards of 1,000 years. But the individual trees will be somewhere, maybe that 20 to 40 range is typical. In an urban environment, you don't get as much of that spreading and kind of colony development. You get more individual or, a few trees here and there. And individual trees here in Denver are probably only going to last somewhere in that 20 to 30-year range typically. So while they're really cool for your house and they have a great color change and they're unique and the bark looks great, they tend to be one of those trees that's short-lived, has a lot of replacement, and they're not always the best choice for like your prominent front yard tree. I see them more as a property line tree or something that maybe like these are kind of tucked up against a structure because they grow nice and narrow and kind of compact, but do plan on having some loss over time and maybe even some replacement with suckers over time. Another cool thing about those suckers is that they are technically clones, so they will have the same genetics, and you can tell they have the same genetics, and you can tell which trees in your in your yard are clones because they will all change color at the same time. So if you have multiple trees on your property and these 5 over here change on one day and the other 3 or 4 change on another day, you can tell that those are actually different groups of aspens that came from different root structures. Aspens can repopulate through seeds, much like other trees. They have something called a catkin, which is almost like a hanging kind of cascading thing of leaves. It looks almost like the tree's covered in caterpillars. But the seeds are very unsuccessful. They don't have a high success rate. Whether that just be poor germination or wrong timing, they tend to come out before the leaves do in spring, and then they just don't disperse as well as other trees might. So typically when you see aspens, it's coming off those root shoots. It's clones rather than seeds that have sprouted. Aspens tend to have about 3 issues that we see often. One of them is this poplar twig gallfly, and that is what's causing these kind of knobby growths along the trunk. This fly feeds on the newest year of growth and basically causes this little home for itself, for its larvae to overwinter in. It tends to not have much of a health issue for the tree. The damage is shallow, circulation isn't really affected. It just is a little unsightly. Sometimes it'll get really, really bad and we'll get phone calls about it because it looks bad. But it really isn't something that's worth treating or anything that people treat for, at least not chemically. There are some parasitic wasps that will go after that pest, but it's not something that as a homeowner you should be worried about. We also tend to see aphids in these trees. You could have them where they're bad enough that they cause some leaf curling and some canopy dieback. And if that's the case, there are treatments that are pretty effective for that. The last thing we see with this tree is something called Cytospora canker. It will be a oozy wound on the tree, typically on the trunk, and that is something where the circulation's compromised, and it's a fungal infection that you tend to not do much treatment for. There are certain things that we can do if it's a less severe case, but it's something you want to really stay on top of, and you'll notice it because of that oozing, sickly appearance. We really only see 2 or 3 lookalikes for this species. It's very distinct. One of those lookalikes would be paper birch. They're something that's going to have that really distinct white bark. They also get those catkins, those seed kind of caterpillar looking hanging seed things. They look a little different, but if you're not an arborist, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. But paper birch will have a much more flaky, curled bark. They tend to have stuff that peels off kind of papery. And they will have some of these horizontal cracks, but they tend to be more distinct, more aggressive. And they don't have a lot of the kind of black spotting on them. Their leaves also look a bit different. They're a little more oval shaped, and they have a much different seed if you get to that point. It's more of a wing nut appearance, which hopefully we can pull up some pictures of, but it looks different. Also, cottonwoods. Obviously, we can all tell what a giant cottonwood is, but when they're young, they look very similar to a young aspen. Cottonwoods have a much deeper seated spade-shaped leaf that is more serrated. They also don't tend to go towards this really white texture, and they don't get the same seeds. They have a much more cottony seed to them. And then the last one I would say is a Lombardy poplar. It's in that poplar family that looks very similar, has the same kind of narrow growth form, but the branching structure starts way lower, way tighter. They grow quite a bit larger when they mature. They don't tend to limb up like these do, and they have more of that cottonwood-shaped leaf, that much more deep-seated spade-shaped leaf. Thank you all for watching the video. Like and subscribe for more content like this.